Good afternoon. I'm Sandra Maxon, and on behalf of the Board of Directors for the Victoria Festival of Authors, I'm thrilled to introduce Welcome to the Candy House, featuring Jennifer Egan in conversation with Zsuzsi Gartner. Although we're gathered virtually, I want to start by acknowledging that the Victoria Festival of Authors is located on the traditional ancestral territories of the Lekwungen people, also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. We acknowledge the ancestors, hereditary leaders, and matriarchs, as well as the creators from these lands, and give thanks for the privilege of living and working here. We are committed to serving as learners and listeners. If you are joining us from outside Lekwungen territory, please feel free to share your own territorial acknowledgement in the Q&A. Join me in thanking our sponsors, the BC Arts Council, Canada Council of the Arts, the CRD, the City of Victoria, Access Copyright, the Victoria Foundation, and Munro's Books. This event and all VFA events offers closed captioning. Please click the double C at the bottom of your screen to view captions. If you have questions for us or for the authors during the event, please enter them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The moderator will be able to get to some of these questions near the end of the panel. This panel is moderated by Zsuzsi Gartner. Zsuzsi is the author of the Scotia Giller Prize finalist, Better Living Through Plastic Explosives, and the widely acclaimed short story collection, All the Anxious Girls on Earth. Her novel, The Beguiling, was a finalist for the 2020 Writers' Trust Fiction Prize and a Globe and Mail Best Book. Zsuzsi lives in Vancouver.
Thank you, Sandra. I am really thrilled to be here, and thanks to the board and Laura Trunke and the Victoria Fest for inviting me to do this interview, because I've been really excited about this. I actually think Jennifer Egan doesn't need an introduction, but these things must be done. So she is the author of the Pulitzer Prize winning and National Books Critics Circle novel, A Visit from the Goon Squad, that came out in 2010. 2011 winner, as well as 5 other works of fiction, including 2017's Manhattan Beach, also an award-winning novel, and a little departure for her, a historical novel largely set during World War II in New York. And Jennifer has also, recently stepped down in 2020 as president of Pan America, and I hope we get a chance to talk about that a bit amongst all the other things we're going to talk about. So welcome.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here, wherever here is.
That's true, right? Neither of us are at home right now. We're in hotel rooms, different places, but that's okay because we're here and you're there and we're all here. You were going to give us a little taste right off the top from, oh my God, I didn't say her new novel, The Candy House. Is not a sequel, but a kind of a fraternal twin or sibling novel to Welcome to the Goon Squad, and is the novel we're going to be talking about and celebrating today. So you're going to give us a little taste of that.
Sure. So there, like A Visit from the Goon Squad, this book is very much of a kind of ensemble story in which every chapter is from a different point of view, but there's a kind of spinal column to it, which is a device that becomes a kind of important cultural force in the time that the book takes place, which is called Own Your Unconscious. And it allows people to externalize the whole of their consciousnesses. And if they want, purely voluntary, they can share all or part of their own memories in exchange for access to this collective consciousness where anyone who shares memories are. And all of this was invented by a guy named Bix Bouton, who was moved to create this machine when he discovered how little he was able to remember about a very important event that occurred while he was at NYU, which is that he partied all night with a couple of friends. They went to the East River to watch the sunrise. And then those two guys went down the river. Bix went home. They ended up going swimming in sort of unclear circumstances. And one of them drowned, a guy named Rob. So So this is from the little section I'm going to read now. It's actually from the point of view of the person who was with Rob in the river when the current pulled him away. And this is a man named Drew. Bix Bouton was the last person to see Rob and me before our East River swim. He got in touch with me out of the blue in 2016 when Own Your Unconscious was blowing up. Bix wrote that it was his memory of Rob and that morning and those years, his difficulty remembering them, that first spurred him to try to mass produce a memory externalization device. It filled me with relief to know that Bix, whom I hadn't seen since NYU and who'd become in the interim a tech demi-god on a first name basis with the world, was still moved by Rob's death. Not long after Bix got back in touch, Sasha and I went to New York to visit him and Lizzie. The four of us watched Bix's memory of April 6th, 1993 on separate headsets. Bix started rolling as we arrived at the East River at sunrise. "Gentlemen, good morning," came Bix's voice, and there were Rob and me through Bix's eyes. Two shaggy-haired 19-year-olds. Kids was my first thought. As a parent, I saw Rob with aching clarity through the screen of his reddish stubble. His exhaustion and worry, an edgy eagerness to please that his irony couldn't conceal. At one point, he lifted up his arms in a stretch, and I caught the old football bulk, the ridges of pink scar tissue inside his wrists. And then there was the part I'd failed or maybe refused to see at the time, a tenderness when Rob looked at me, a trusting admiration that was obviously love. I wished fleetingly that Bix hadn't silenced the thought and feeling portion of his consciousness. I wanted to know if he'd seen it. Would Bix have recognized the fumbling proposition Rob made to me some 20 minutes later as inevitable? But the real torture was watching my 19-year-old self, cocky and full of hope, unaware that within the hour, I would begin the after portion of my life in which I would try endlessly and futilely to atone. Gentlemen, good morning. We watched the memory again and again. I was clutching Sasha's hand and I felt her weeping. But repetition dulled her response, and at some point, she and Lizzie removed their headsets and took a bottle of wine up to the roof deck. I had to keep watching. There was something I needed to pinpoint in the lull, that last pause before Rob and I waved goodbye and began walking south along the river in the blinding metallic early morning sunlight. And then we were out of sight. Bix had turned and was walking toward the 6th Street overpass, heading to his apartment on East 7th Street. Wait, stop. I couldn't keep myself from exhorting him. Turn around, call us back. Stop it, stop it, stop it. I realized I was shouting only when Bix switched off my headset and lifted it gently away.
Thank you. That's like, I had sweaty palms revisiting that. And I want to move, we'll talk about the tech stuff, but I want to address this idea of a sibling novel and how you've taken what were minor characters or children and major characters that now appear in minor detail or cameos. And there's a particular thrill in that, but it's not necessary to have read Goon Squad to appreciate how fantastic the Candy House is. But there is a special frisson of recognition. For instance, if I'm remembering correctly, there's a chapter in Goon Squad that's from Rob's, who drowns, point of view until the moment we know he's drowning.
Yeah, it's
And
true.
then,
We witnessed the drowning from his point of view. That's right.
Yeah. But there's all kinds of this fluidity going on. And I don't know, did you think in the aftermath on the success of the Visit from the Goon Squad and while you were working on Manhattan Beach, that you would be doing this? Like, when did the idea come to you that I'm going to revisit this way of writing and these characters and their attenuated families and acquaintances, and with a different focus, the music industry and now the tech industry? Like,
well, in a way, I never really moved away from the material, because it's the nature of books like this that they always feel unfinished. If every chapter is about a different person, and of course, every person is the center of their own constellation of friends, family, memories, experience, each individual chapter, each thing I add, each element I add offers a whole constellation of new possibilities. And there's also a very high failure ratio with these books. I try a lot of things that don't work because I'm interested in using different forms and trying to try kooky things that I wouldn't really try to sustain over a whole book. But, 9 times out of 10, they don't work. And when they don't work, that adds to the unfinished feeling for me, because sometimes I end up having written about characters and situations that then aren't actually in the book. So there's this sort of weird disconnect between what I know and what the reader knows. So anyway, all of that is to say that even by the time I was on my book tour for A Visit from the Goon Squad, I was already working on a chapter of The Candy House. It wasn't that I thought, oh, gee, I wish I could have included this. It felt like something else, but it just seemed like, why would I stop? So there was never, and the other thing is, these are books that are really driven by curiosity, as you say, Zsuzsi. It's catching a glimpse of someone from the corner of your eye and then being plunged inside their perspective. These are books that are always playing with perspective, and so they're, in a sense, curiosity is the driving force in these narratives. And as long as I'm curious, there's a temptation to keep going. But the one question was, would I really collect the new material into a book? That I did not know, because I figured I wouldn't do it unless I really felt like it was strong on its own merits and not just a kind of echo of the earlier book. And unless I felt it was really about its own distinct stuff. So that came into focus later. But as far as pursuing the material, I was doing it right from the beginning.
And you mentioned the constraints and the stuff you try, and the kooky things that sometimes work, like the whole PowerPoint presentation from Allison's point of view about her family and brother, who Sasha and Drew are her parents, of course. But the Venn diagrams, like Venn diagrams as narrative, that just blew me away. And it was so amazing. What were some of the kooky things you tried, either in the previous book and in Candy House, like POVs or approaches or forms that didn't work? I'm just curious, like, if you could share that.
Well, there are some forms I still haven't found a way to use, and I'm not going to mention those because I feel like I'm still hoping they will work. But even when I do eventually find a way to use a form like PowerPoint, for example, I've usually failed several times before that. PowerPoint is actually really hard to use to write fiction for various reasons. It's very hard to portray action. It has a kind of cold corporate vibe. So a lot of things I tried to do just wouldn't live in PowerPoint. And so by the time I finally was able to make it work, some of that earlier material had started to develop in my mind, but I hadn't been able to use it, for example. And then there are a bunch of things in the Candy House that, there's an epistolary chapter. There's a chapter narrated in the first person plural as we by a pair of sisters. And in both those cases, I had tried to use them in other ways and in other configurations and wasn't able to. So there's a lot of trial and error, and that's even assuming that it does work out, that I can make an unusual structure work.
Now you also have I guess it's like a spy manual later, like quite a lengthy spy, and it appears like a manual, like it's like written in the imperative, I guess, like do this, do this, do this.
Well, the way I conceived of it actually was a spy narrating her mission in the form of the lesson she learns from each thing she does. And there's actually a very specific reason that I ended up even thinking about such a thing, which is that I keep a ridiculous number of lists on my phone that sort of guide me through my life. And I have lists of like forms I want to try, lists of ideas that interest me, lists of gifts. And, you know, it gets absolutely domestic and trivial. But one of the lists I had for a while was called Lessons Learned. And it was a list of things that I wanted to do differently in my life. And so, you know, like a lot of lists that one keeps on one's phone, or at least that I do, if you don't use them for a while, they sort of become dormant and they fall to the bottom of the list of lists. And so I just kind of forget about them. But I find that when I look back at lists of any kind, I'm always struck by how there's a lot of unintentional storytelling that a list does. I mean, a list is not trying to, it's not a storytelling, it's not an intentional storytelling device. But if you think about it, if you look at someone's grocery list, for example, you learn an enormous amount about them. You're learning about a human being from that list. Anyway, this list of lessons learned included things like buy a narrower Christmas tree, or the one my favorite was put train ticket in bag night before, always in all caps. And what I liked about that was that even though there was no narrative to it, I knew exactly what had gone wrong with the train ticket just from reading that directive. And so then I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool to write a whole story in which we only know what has happened from the lesson the character derives from what has happened. And in other words, in which the whole thing is inadvertent storytelling rather than intentional storytelling. And so that's a very abstract idea, but I had that kicking around in my head for a while. And at the same time, I was very interested in using Twitter as a storytelling device, just for obvious reasons. It's a genre of narration. And so that, coupled with the idea of a list of lessons learned, became a mode of storytelling for this very genre-esque spy story involving a minor character from Goon Squad named Lulu. So there are a lot of different ideas and questions that converge. And it's interesting because everything I'm saying, even as I hear myself, it's like, it sounds so abstract. I mean, how are you going to get fiction out of this that anyone wants to read? And the answer is sometimes I don't. But when I do, it's because I'm able to somehow root it in time and place, and actually like sensory perceptions, which is really where I start. So, you know, all of these ideas were there, but what really got me into it was this idea of this, you know, young woman working for the US government, undercover on the Mediterranean, trying to infiltrate a group of plotters against America, and narrating her mission in the form of lessons learned. And that's sort of how that came about.
Oh, wow, that's really cool. I don't know if, are you familiar with Rick Moody's short story collection, Demonology?
Yes.
Well, you know how he tries different, like he has the Willie Fanstock box set, and it's a young man's, it's all his, it's basically cassette tapes labeled, and he puts together, and the story is narrated through these songs he's chosen and why. And then there's another one, his kind of list of graduate school texts, and they're annotated to create a story of his time. And that's a more, I think that's almost it's an autobiographical story. But this idea of using these kind of constraints, it can feel quite liberating, because then you know what you know what not to include, and you don't need all that connective tissue and stuff like that. Is that part of the interest of it?
Well, it feels liberating only if I have found a story that cannot be told any other way. And that's actually really sort of good to know, because of course, generally, when there are such severe limits on storytelling, it doesn't feel liberating. It feels totally constraining. And one reason there's so much trial and error in trying to find ways to use some of these forms is that very often when I begin, I immediately feel constrained. And if I do, that's a sign that I'm trying to force something that isn't really organically sound. And so I let that go. But when I feel liberated, as I did in writing that chapter called Lulu the Spy, when I have a sense of possibilities, of things, of sort of space opening up rather than shutting me down, that's a sign that I actually have found a story that I can tell this way, which is exciting because it also means that I'm doing something I wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And that's, it's, from my point of view, terrific.
That's so great. And speaking of language and things like that, I want to talk about math. Like, are you good at math, or are you just good at faking being interested and good at math? Because there's two chapters and they're both fantastic. And one is Chris Salazar, who Benny, if people remember Benny from Goon Squad, but Benny also is in Candy House, and he really develops for me. Like, I just love Benny, and his son has this job again, the cool tech stuff that you're doing in the book. There's different technologies, not just the own your consciousness is the big mega thing, but Chris has this job because he's good at math. He's algebraizing or creating algebraic systems for movie and TV elements, or movie and TV tropes, and making algebraic kind of things. Could you explain that a bit? And then about your interest in math in general, and then I'll jump over to the other math section, which is Lincoln and his numbers and percentages.
I'm not especially good at math, although I think I would have gotten further in math if not for my sophomore high school teacher, Mr. Nickerson, who was a very bad math teacher for reasons that perhaps I can now understand when I recall that all of his volume problems used vodka as the substance in question. So I think Mr. Nickerson may have had other challenges that were impacting his math teaching, but the bottom line is that was trigonometry, and I did so badly, I really couldn't proceed. I had enjoyed math before that. Anyway, but my interest in math for this book came along via, again, sort of a number of routes. I mean, one is just, the cultural obsession with data, which is just omnipresent. And not only something that comes up constantly, but also the business explains the business model for a lot of online activity. We pay with our data, as we now all kind of understand, although it took me a really long time to understand that. We pay with our data for things that seem to be free. And so obviously that data is very valuable. But what good is it really? I find myself thinking at times, like when Trump was elected and no one saw it coming, or when 9/11 happened and no one saw it coming, or when the pandemic happened and no one saw it coming. So I was very struck by the kind of paradox that we seem to know so much, we've never known more, and yet it seems to be more useful in retrospect often than as a predictive tool. So what is data exactly, and what can it tell us? But I think that the real the real catalyst for my interest in math was actually one of my kids, who is a huge baseball fan, and baseball is a very statistical sport, as many people know. And there was one night when I was saying, okay, I was of course always trying to get my kids to read, probably way more than I should have. And I said, okay, now it's time to read. And he said, I am reading. And he was looking at a big book of statistics. And I said, no, I don't mean that's not reading. You're looking at numbers. I mean, read a story. And he said, I am reading a story. And he said, look, I'll show you. And he showed me a table that contained all of the statistics from a particular player's career. And he narrated the story of the career using that box of statistics. And for me, it was a lightning bolt moment, because I suddenly realized that that is also storytelling. And then I started thinking about it more, and I thought, algebraic equations are stories. And then there was another thought I had, which was when I saw a very successful movie a few years ago, which will go nameless, because I was incredulous at the fact that every single moment in this movie and every word that came out of every character's mouth was a total cliche. Like at a certain point, I thought, this is almost impossible. This is a feat. There's not a single original thing happening here. It's incredible. And then I thought, you could easily just graph this movie, because if you assign a value to each of those tropes, then we're really just writing equations, essentially. And then I have these thoughts all the time. And then the next thought is usually, I have to use that. I'll think, how can I use that? And so that's where it came to me. What if in the world of my novel, I have a character whose job is to do exactly that, to assign values to familiar tropes and cliches and, just plot points that we see again and again and again, and then write out scenes and action in the form of equations using those values. So that's where it sort of all came from. I just wander through my life having these thoughts, and then I try to put them to some use.
It's all that synchronicity, because you're just, the feelers are out. Like I'm writing a book. How does this, I'm interested in this, so why not use it? And in that chapter with Chris, like he has this job and then he gets involved in a bit of a fiasco movie-ish situation himself. And he starts the algebraizing, is that how you say it? Algebraizing, the action of what's happening to him. And he goes from like bit player to, it's lovely. And then the math thing pops up again in, Lincoln, who has Asperger's, and he's in his 20s in this particular chapter that he
First of all, I would just say I never diagnose anyone.
No, but that's how to, okay, he is good at, his language is numbers, let's just say that. And he is the brother of Allison, who did the whole PowerPoint thing in Goon Squad, but here he has his own trajectory, and he's got this he's in love with this woman he works with, who also is very good at numbers. The other people are called typicals, but they work with these typicals, and they have to ferret out. This leads to talking about the Mandela cube again, but we'll jump to that later. The eluders. There's this whole idea that there's people who don't want to have a social media presence, and they become called the eluders. And am I understanding it correctly? They hire people to be them online so they could just disappear and have no online lives. And
it's a little more extreme than that, because in the world of the collective consciousness, so a world in which an enormous number of people are sharing all or part of their memories to a collective, everyone ends up being represented in that collective, whether they want to be or not. Because even if I choose to never even externalize my memory, so many people with experiences of me do share their memories that I am in there. So what ends up happening is that there are some people who are so appalled by this and so unwilling to participate, although they have no choice, that they end up casting off their identities altogether. So they essentially cede their identities to this collective, and they disappear and start over as new people. But if they just disappear suddenly, that's very obvious. Everyone will notice that they're gone, and it will be, everyone will know that they've done this, and that they're not online or anywhere else as their former selves. So what they do is that they hire what are known as proxies, to impersonate them online. And a proxy can range from just a program that kind of uses all of your online utterances to mimic you, but that's not a very precise form. The best proxies in the world of the Candy House are fiction writers, because we're good at impersonating people. And in fact, I was a private secretary for years and literally impersonated my boss in a number of different situations. So there are proxies that are operative, and what that means is that for someone like Lincoln, who works for a data collection service, like he deals in data, that's the currency of his employer. These proxies are a gigantic problem, because it's sort of like saying, there are too many bots on Twitter. These proxies they're gathering data on people who aren't really people. And so that makes their data not as valuable. So figuring out who is a proxy and who is real is an important part of Lincoln's world and his job.
So he works with a bunch of people who all do the same thing, but he's in love with M. It's so charming, this love story. Like she for the Halloween party at work, she dresses as a teacup. And I love this, he loves this, he thinks it's wonderful. And the fact that this other guy who she's gonna marry doesn't come as the teapot or the tea cozy or a tea bag or whatever, like he doesn't appreciate she's dressed as a teapot, like he's convinced, teacup, he's convinced that this guy can't really love her. But anyway, if you could just read this page, get us a taste of Lincoln's voice,
Sure.
That would be fantastic, because it's just so good.
So this is picking up on the question of how at this firm that Lincoln works for, they try to ferret out the proxies. And what we learn is that humor is a very tricky element in the world of data, because it cannot be quantified. All right, so here's Lincoln. But how is it possible that humor can't be quantified? Simple. Because we lack a basic set of definitional terms for what is funny. And yet, some people are funny and others are not. Some of those who are funny may be funny in ways they didn't intend. I am certainly in this category, as are many of us counters. We are quantifiers. As children, we were perceived as off-putting. To this day, I can tell you the exact length of the pause in any piece of pop music you'd care to name beginning at Elvis. This fixation did not endear me to anyone except my family, and only because I was already dear to them. My fixation was social poison, as were, I'm told by fellow counters, their habits of measuring neighbors' fences, cataloging Arthurian suits of armor, mapping and reporting on solar storms, or in M's case, tending 268 houseplants in her childhood bedroom, not counting the grass with which she seeded her wall-to-wall carpet, and which forced its roots into the, it turned out, decayed floorboards underneath said carpet, until after a vigorous watering, a large chunk of the ceiling in the room below M's, the kitchen as it happened, broke free and fell into the middle of the dinner table. Now, that is funny for sure. At least it was when M told the story at O'Brien's taco party, when each team member shared a childhood anecdote. And yet embedded in the comedy are both sadness and triumph. Sadness because M was already isolated, friendless, and at odds with her family, and the ceiling debacle resulted in the dismantling of her plant system, and when she afterward refused to eat, hospitalization and tube feeding. Triumph because now she is M, gorgeous and sexy and well-paid, and the world has bent her way. Most of the stories we tell, my fellow counters and I, have both these components, sadness and triumph, because the world has come around to us. It's unbelievable. I still can't believe it. And while our ranks are fortified by typicals whose adolescence may have included popularity and statistical expertise limited to sanctioned realms like baseball stats, the fact is that we are simply better at counting. We are native speakers, if you will, many of us having understood numbers before we did language.
Thank you for indulging me, but that's excellent. And it just really does give a flavor of his voice and the idea. But this idea, like he said, understand numbers before language, but back to, we're talking about you using numbers as language. Like you have managed to use numbers as language in the book, which is pretty freaking awesome.
Although I will tell you, what I wanted to do and wasn't able to do. In fact, I wasn't even able to really get this started. But ever since I had that encounter, that conversation with my son about the table of statistics, I thought, I want to write a chapter that's just a table. Like you have to read the table to read the narrative. But the problem is that I am too far from being a native speaker of numbers to pull that off. So I wasn't able to do that. I had to resort to basically fake math in my algebra, equations. But it was really, I have a tendency to think of statistics and narrative as having nothing to do with each other. And I think that the insight that really came to me as I worked on this book is that is a false binary. And that in fact, back to the question of why statistics sometimes are not predictive, the answer is never that the statistics were missing. In other words, the information about 9/11 being imminent was there. It did exist. But the problem was that it was not interpreted in such a way that anyone figured out what was coming. So what is the interpretation of statistics? Well, another word for that, as far as I can see, is storytelling. I mean, interpretation is where statistics become narrative. And so the idea of these being two different things, I think, is wrong. And that was so thrilling to think about, actually.
And your son enlightened you to that, but you put in that dig about baseball stats, the normative use. But and I'll leave this math thing alone, but I was really impressed because the late David Foster Wallace, who was a math brainiac and used math in certain stories, but just like, and I was a fan, but those things were unreadable. Whereas when you use the math, it's understandable. So because
you're not better at math than I am.
but then so the text, I read something in an interview, I didn't know this, that you knew Stephen Jobs.
Yes, I did. A long time ago, but yes.
So, and did that inform your interest in tech at all, or is that just like an aside?
I'm not really that interested in tech, honestly. Okay. And in this book, it really came about. I didn't really know that the through line would be tech exactly. Okay. That came about very inductively. So, for example, I mentioned that on my book tour for A Visit from the Goon Squad, I was already working on a chapter, and I wrote a few more chapters in 2011, 2012, and this Lincoln one was one of them, actually. So my sense that tech would matter in the book came about very much just naturally from following characters into their futures. And I knew I was curious about Lincoln. I wrote this chapter that felt really fun about him. Certain things about the future that in the world that I'm writing about became clear just from his story. And then I used that information to understand better the world that these people were living in. And the machine, Own Your Unconscious, came into focus very late. In fact, again, Lincoln was really important because there's a moment when he's trying to figure out how to make Emma fall in love with him. And he briefly considers that he could view her inner life and find out what she likes, like what turns her on. And he realized, but he immediately discounts that. He dismisses that because that would be a violation. That's not allowed. And she would loathe him after that. So it would defeat the purpose. It was really from that little moment that I first realized that in the future, I was imagining this possibility of actually viewing someone else's thoughts from the inside existed. It came about very spontaneously as I was working on that Lincoln chapter. So that's kind of where the tech came from. I did no research in the world of tech, and I think it's very fair to say I am a late and incompetent adopter. I'm bad at it. I never exchange my devices until they break. So I think it's the realm in which a lot of this unfolds, because that happened organically in the stories I was telling, but not out of any interest really on my part.
That's just fascinating. And I like your attitude to the planned obsolescence. I'm always railing against it. You wouldn't believe my phone. Like my son calls it the flip phone. It's not a flip phone, but my son calls it a flip phone because it might as well be a flip phone. But yeah. When okay, I noticed the tiny things sometimes, and it reminds me of, and the way you use time, of David Mitchell and his whole enterprise where characters exist on different time frames and appear in different books in different ways, and sometimes it's just a glimpse. And like time, like in Goon Squad, and I think more than one person said time's a goon, like the goons, time is this thing, but time is like a character in these two books with you, like the way you blow up time and blow up chronology, and the ordering of, seeing this person as a youth here and as already dying over here or dead over here, but it's not like flashback in conventional novels. It's not like, let's go back and see. It appears in its own place. And there's this increased poignancy of already knowing what happened to someone and then seeing the fresh enthusiasm. Like there's a way, like it just massages and plays the emotions as well. How closely or not closely do you work out this non-chronology when you're writing, or do things get shuffled around after you've written various chunks and chapters and presentations?
The actual order is something that is clear late, because with A Visit from the Goon Squad, I actually thought the chronology would run straight backwards.
Wow.
So I actually didn't realize that there would be no chronology. I think that felt too scary to contemplate. I mean, we rely on chronology. I mean, a sentence is a chronology, and time passing is the essential ingredient of any work of fiction, I would argue. You could even say that any work of fiction is to some degree about time passing. So the idea of letting go of chronology feels like a real free fall. However, when I read A Visit from the Goon Squad in its backward order, I found that it was very flat. Like it just didn't gather power. And in the end, to hell with everything else except that question of, does the work gain power as you read? Does it gain tension? And the answer was no. So I thought, okay, I have a problem. Maybe my book is just not good, or maybe there's some way in which I'm thwarting pleasures that would be present if I restructured this. And I found that was really the case, because in both of these books, the fun, hopefully, for the reader is that sense of seeing something laterally and then being plunged into the middle of it. But if I'm sticking to a chronological sequence, whether going forward or backward, I can't create those juxtapositions. I have to wait until the time has passed so that we get to that moment. And it's the juxtapositions and the satisfaction of curiosity and the kind of bursts of surprise that really are what these books are built around. So the organizing force is not chronology, but curiosity. Now, this is not true in everything I do by any means, but in these books, that seems to be what works best. And what you say is so true, that there is a kind of poignancy in already knowing the outcome and then seeing what happens earlier, not in the form of a kind of illustrative flashback, which I'm not a big fan of, but more just in the sense that, we live our lives wondering what will happen. And it's a very different experience to watch that life be lived when you know the answer to that question. It just felt like a different way to approach it. One more point I'll say is that with A Visit from the Goon Squad, it was very explicitly a book about time. In The Candy House, of course, it raises a lot of those same reflections because the structure is once again using curiosity as an organizing principle rather than chronology. But I conceived of The Candy House as much more a book about space. And in a way, another way of saying space is perspective. I was very interested in the question of, first of all, how technology has impacted our sense of space, and the fact that we're having this conversation virtually, illustrates that almost without saying anything else. I mean, a lot of what we do happens in a place that's not a real place, but also the fact that we are lodged in our own perspectives in life and unable to actually enter the point of view of another person, and therefore juxtaposing points of view is in a certain way a kind of spatial exercise. Where we stand affects what we see, and it can be fun to place the reader in radically different positions and to let the story unfold via those juxtapositions.
Well, I love what you do with POV and the fact that you explore so many ways of entering this and juxtaposing the consciousnesses, and the whole, the Mandela Cube consciousness, sharing consciousness thing is also a great gift to you as a writer. It's an amazing way to do omniscience that wouldn't make sense, like to create an omniscient, somebody narrating something of something they couldn't possibly know, but we know they know it. And I'm thinking specifically about Lou's daughter, who starts narrating a story about, well, we don't know she's narrating at first because it just sounds like an omniscient narration. Then we find out it's Lou's daughter, and he's 31, and we see him, Lou Klein, going into the redwoods with his buddies, and yeah, and then how, and then we realize, okay, because she has accessed his memories of this whole thing, and but there's that double thing, like he's perceiving, and then she's relating. You're relating through her to the reader, his perceptions. There's this layering of perception and what is noticed and what's important to people. And then we're, as readers, layering on what we already know about these characters or what's happened in the different spaces in these characters' lives. So I don't know if I just made that sound way more complicated than it is, because it's it's a beautiful chapter, and just that idea of, that space isn't even there anymore from the perspective, from the time frame that it is being narrated from. This is so long ago, and it's ash now. And
well, it seemed one thing there was, as you say, with an omniscient narrator, I mean, in a certain way, an omniscient narrator needs no justification. Like an omniscient narrator can know everything. But it was interesting to me to think, well, let's make a little more of the question of how this narrator knows. And I've done this before, like in my Gothic thriller, The Keep, there are layers of narration. We aren't sure who the narrator is, and that the surprise of sort of whose eyes we're looking for unfolds a couple of times. And that's sort of interesting to me, because the question for me, what I'm always trying to do when I write fiction is to put it very simply, just as much as possible, because life is so complicated and perception is so complicated. And the job of a fiction writer, it seems to me, is to suggest as much of that complexity as possible in hopefully a very entertaining way, and also in as small a space as possible. It's really an act of compression. So if I can be writing omnisciently and yet also be in two different people's points of view, why not? Like, that seems really fun. And so the fun of using this machine was not in any way I think what people sort of call world building, like, coming up with lots of complicated information about the machine and how it's used. And that's not really what made it exciting for me. but rather the ways that people could use it and the fun I could have writing about them using it in that way. So as you say, there's a chapter in which a woman is able to revisit a day from her father's life through his eyes when she was only 6. So part of the memory is, part of the experience is her seeing herself from her father's point of view, along with all of his internal thoughts, which unfortunately for her include an awareness that he loves her brother more than he loves her, which I'm sure was not fun to experience. But she's really doing this to solve a mystery. And the mystery is, why did her father leave the family? He was a happy man. He was happily married. He loved her mother. They were a happy family. He went away for a weekend and he came back, in some sense, a different person. By revisiting this day through his eyes, she learns the answer to that question. So there's a lot of mystery solving in the book. And sometimes what spurred me to think about this stuff was actually exactly that, a kind of hungry, curious wish that I could do that in my own life. You know, it would be great to be able to revisit memories. It would be fascinating. I mean, would it be great? Maybe not, but it's the temptation to do it is profound. Another thing that I was very curious about, and this also comes from my own life, is I find myself thinking back on glancing encounters that I've had with people over the years, people I don't even remember the names of, and wondering, who were they and who are they? Like, especially, where are they now? You know, I just wish I could see them. Well, you know, I found myself thinking, okay, I want to write a chapter in which that's possible, but why is it possible? I mean, am I just going to insist that this is a world where people can do that? There has to be a reason. And that's what I mean when I say that the machine kind of came to me gradually, more through the things I wanted it to do than any sort of grand concept of this amazing technology I wanted to invent.
Wow. I know there's a lot of writers probably watching, and I think this could serve as a masterclass in writing any kind of fiction, because that idea of why not, like, don't dismiss those things that come to you, whether it's like trying something, like, don't dismiss it before you've tried it. Like you said, you just try the kookiest things, and sometimes, oh my God, it's a payoff, and sometimes, okay, that doesn't work. But I think people really restrict themselves by writing, this is the way it should be done, or this is what's, you know, just, I think, yeah, I just love, and you use the word curious and curiosity so often, and I find that so refreshing, because it's like you're pleasing yourself. Are you pleasing yourself when you write and follow all these rabbit holes and things like that?
No, I mean, pleasing myself is, you know, that's sort of the entry point, but in the end, that is by no means enough. And I have many layers of feedback that I use. I'm actually glad you asked that, because I can sometimes make it sound like I do this in a vacuum. It's really not true. I have a writing group that I meet with regularly, and I actually dedicated the Candy House to them. We bring in work, we only read aloud, which is an interesting aspect of the group, and something I recommend, because it forces you to really attend to the music and the rhythm of the language and the storytelling. And, you know, storytelling, of course, began as an oral tradition. So I think that's really useful thing to stay connected to, is just, what is this like as an auditory experience? But I bring in things really early just to see if they feel alive. And then at later points, you know, to ask more sophisticated questions. And then I have a number of other readers who read my stuff who aren't in the writing group, but will read longer things. So pleasing myself is, you know, a nice start, but that is, in the end, I really need to find out whether what I am trying to do is what I'm actually doing. But I would say, you know, I do feel like it's useful to read, to stay connected to the beginnings of the novel, to read 18th and 19th century fiction, because I think we have this notion that that stuff is quote unquote conventional. nothing could be further from the truth. What we are producing today is so much more conventional. And I think one reason is that it's easy to forget all the things the novel can do. It was invented to do anything. It was invented because it could do more than epic poetry could do in terms of storytelling. It has always absorbed every kind of discourse that existed, legal documents, letters. Some of the great early novels are epistolary. And there's also just a kind of swaggering willingness, narrators popping in and out, addressing the reader directly, pulling away, point of view going everywhere. It's really worth reading this stuff actively to just remember what a powerful tool fiction is, and to free ourselves from what can really start to feel like a lot of kind of culturally imposed constraints, including branding questions or categorization questions like, well, is this a novel or a short story collection? Yeah. Who gives a damn? I just feel like we need to keep fiction strong. And the best way we can do that is by remembering how strong it started, and to be confident that we don't need to limit ourselves. It has to work. It has to be fun. And that's where the effort comes in. But I agree with you very much. There's no reason to limit ourselves at the get-go.
Yeah. Standing ovation. Like, for example, Tristan Shandy by Lawrence Stern. Like, he was
so good.
Oh my God. He was like footnote. He was the footnote guy. He was like David Foster Wallace way before David Foster Wallace. Like, it is the zaniest. And I just sent my son Candide by Voltaire. My son's 22. And he texted, he says, Jesus Christ, I'm going to beep, beep, beep. What a beep, 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 amazing bloody book. Like, madness. I said, I knew you'd love it. Like, just crazy shit, right? Yeah, it's worth going back. And all the great omniscient narrators, like all the great, Dear Reader, all the Dear Reader stuff, the Gothic stuff. I just love that too. So thank you for that thing. And language, speaking of language, so Bix's son, Gregory, becomes a writer. And this is important. I don't want to give away anything, and he spurns the technology. He doesn't upload his thing. He doesn't want to look at his dad's. He doesn't want anything to do with it. But the part I just love this. So he's got this Athena, you named her Athena, the creative writing professor. And she's like, she's a cliche, but she's like living it. Like, she's the sexy, I sleep with all my students, but I only do it once. And then they're all like lusting after her. And she's just, it's crazy. But I love what she says about language. She says to her students, find the eluder, she instructed her rapt graduate students, narrowing gold-flecked eyes at them across the seminar table. I want words that are alive, that have a pulse. Hot words, people. Give me the bullet, not the casing. Fire it right into my chest. I will die gladly for some fresh language. I feel like that all the time. I will die gladly for some fresh language. So when I read books like yours and people, of people who care about language and freshness instead of, constrained hermetic minimalism, and I'm showing my biases here. I'm just so elated. Like, language is so great, and why not strive? And similes, like, people avoid metaphoric language. I find people avoid metaphoric language, and your similes are so amazing. I just love them. I'm going to share a few with the viewers here because they're so amazing. Just Eamon's, out of context, they just work perfectly. Eamon's long deadpan face seemed to shield an illicit excitement, Bix thought, like a generic house containing a meth lab. So good. And just a couple of pages later, this couple is looking, it's an academic couple. He returned to the living room to find Cyril and Tessa poring over a volume with carnal transport as if it were a tub of ice cream. And just indulge me, two more. Eventually, only we could still see the flickering, this is a sadder, not funny one, the flickering specter of her young self, flashing and bird-featured like an antic ghost haunting a tumble-down mansion. And then the last one here, just because it's so good, and this one's super simple, but so amazing. So there's this famous writer, and she's got the macho writer look about him. His nose has been broken more than once. He looked like a man who'd been pummeled accidentally into happiness. So you could say he looked like a man who was pummeled into handsomeness. That's even good, but pummeled accidentally into happiness. You know, do these just come to you, or do you work at your similes?
I think it's, sometimes they come to me, but a lot of times they are replacing language that's not that great. And I think that's another thing, I work so hard to get rid of familiar language, but it often starts out familiar. And in fact, ultimately, I am really actually counting my word use, and not allowing myself to use a particular word, more than maybe twice in a whole book. And it actually, I have to really ferret out repetitions, because of course we all have our paths of least resistance and certain words that we rely on. And in the end, overusing them is just such a mistake, because, it weakens every single usage. So there are the moments where something good comes to me, but there are a lot, probably more moments where what I came up with originally was kind of tired, but then just recognizing that tiredness suggested something better. And that's basically what editing is. And I do so many drafts of everything I do, because I'm trying to ultimately take ownership of not just every chapter, but every section, every paragraph, and every sentence. In the end, I should have weighed every single word. Do I succeed? No. And my reading sections, there are edits I want to make even now. There are definitely things that are not up to par, but I do my best, and then they take it away from me, and I find more later. Editing is really what it comes down to.
That you're a brilliant self-editor, but that also reminds me of one of my favorite things about editors, great editors that I've ever read. And then Julian Barnes, in one of his essays, was talking about a new editor at the New Yorker, who they're working through this long piece and blah, 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 blah. And then the editor said, this word crepuscular, you've used this before. And then he goes through this long piece he's submitting. It's not fiction. It's one of his letter from London things. And he says, where? Tell me where I've used this. I've used it once in this piece. And he said, 3 years ago in the blah, blah, blah you wrote. And he said, and you cannot use it again in this one. And then Barnes said, and that, my friends, is editing. This idea that the editor remembered he'd used this, because a word like crepuscular, like you can't use it more than once in a decade, let alone in the same piece. But I think that was a wonderful anecdote about this eagle-eyed editor who really, and Barnes appreciated it. Like, great writers appreciate great editors, and that's just fantastic. I think we might have questions. I'm not sure. I'm not, do we have questions? I was supposed to see something down here. Q&A. There are no questions. So I'm going to go to my one thing I wanted to talk about, and it's kind of a heavier, or it's a more about the zeitgeist in the publishing world right now, and something I'm personally very curious about. So this idea of the affinity charm in the novel, maybe you could just explain that briefly, and then I can pose my question to you.
Well, so the affinity charm is a kind of made up quasi-scientific term. There's an anthropologist in the book named Miranda Klein, who, in doing an ethnography, basically, of a tribe in Brazil that has had no contact with mass sort of modern civilization, she is able to come up with a series of algorithms that can predict how people will respond to each other, and whether they will respond positively to each other based on all of the information that she knows about them. So that sounds a little complicated, but the bottom line is she creates math that is able to predict how people will react to each other. and this is, she publishes this in a very, a kind of academic context, and it has, it has a quiet life in the world of anthropology, which is her field. But then persons unknown, although we later find out who they are, actually sell her algorithms to big tech social media people, including Bix Bouton, who later goes on to invent Own Your Unconscious. And they use her algorithms to monetize social media. That's the notion in the alternate reality of the Candy House. And Miranda Klein, the anthropologist, absolutely abhors this usage of her work. This is not what she wants. She did not intend for it to be used this way. And so she is very unhappy about it. And in fact, ultimately in the novel, she eludes. She's one of the first famous people to shed her identity and essentially disappear. But anyway, the affinity charm is a term from her original work, which describes a person who has a quality that makes everyone think that they're like them. So people who have this charm are seen as an ally by everyone they encounter. And it's called the affinity charm because that's a remarkable quality to have. And it means that this person is liked and sort of has a kind of positive response from everyone around them, way beyond the average person.
Okay, you did a spoiler. You should have said spoiler alert. I've been really careful not to give away anything that happens to anybody. But that's okay. It's your book. If I did it, I'd be mad at myself.
I'm sensitive to spoilers, and in certain books, like my last novel, Manhattan Beach, disastrous to utter spoilers. I think in the case of this book, they matter less, because if you haven't read it, this information isn't going to mean anything to you.
Yeah. Okay.
Note, though, that I did not say who sells Miranda Klein's.
Yes. That is very important.
I'm not going to give.
So what I wanted to refer to is very early in the book, and you mentioned Bix, and this is he's being followed by a woman who's also a PhD student in something, and he's trying to pretend he's not who he is because she thinks he's Bix, and he's like, no, I'm not. And she says, it's freaky how much you look like Bix. You could be brothers. And he says, well, we're both black, Bix said with a grin, quoting the line he'd prepared in advance for a white questioner. Rebecca laughed. My mom is black, she said, half black, half Indonesian. My dad is half Swedish, half Syrian Jew. I was raised Jewish. Don't you win some kind of prize for all that in the race combination sweepstakes? That's Bix says. Actually, I do. Everyone thinks I'm like them. Bix stared at her. You have the affinity charm, he breathed with awe. And you've already explained what the affinity charm is. But my question is, you have characters like Bix, characters like Rebecca, characters like, other genders or other people attracted to whatever. You inhabit whoever you want. And in the sort of publishing zeitgeist, the literary zeitgeist we inhabit right now, particularly in North America, as white middle-aged women writing Black characters who are main characters, like, how do you get away with it when other people can't? And I don't see you crapped on for it. So I think it's brilliant, and I totally think it's great. But has anything come up, like, or did you question yourself at all?
Oh, I question myself vigorously. I mean, let me first say that I never write about myself. I am terrible at it. And so if we end up in a world where only autofiction is allowed, my career will be over, because I am not interested in writing about myself. My writing for me is an act of discovery and escape and adventure. So I have no interest in writing about white middle-aged women like me. So that's kind of my starting point, and that has always been the case. I've always been inhabiting people unlike myself. It's one reason I struggle. I write much more easily from a male point of view, and I have to work hard to keep books like these ensemble books 50-50. If I'm not careful, I will veer into the predominantly male point of view.
Okay.
So I'm used to doing that. And one way that I have always done it, even before this became a vexed issue, is with a lot of due diligence. So, it put on the most basic level, if you're writing about someone doing some kind of work, you had better run this by at least one person who actually does that kind of work to make sure that you are not making obvious mistakes. In the case of writing across race, this has now become a very, a vexed and in some cases kind of an incendiary act. There's a great sensitivity to cultural appropriation, and I totally acknowledge that. When I first wrote so Bix is a minor character in A Visit from the Goon Squad. So we have already met him and we know that he's Black. When I first wrote about him in the Candy House, it was 2012. And it was before some of these issues had become as big and kind of heated as they are now. When I returned to this material in 2016, it felt much more, frankly, scary to write from the point of view of a Black man. But I approached it exactly as I always do. Well, first of all, one person in my writing group is Black. So I had her point of view from the beginning, but I gave the chapter to, I don't know, 6 Black friends and got very considered and unbelievably helpful feedback. I would not have done a good job without them. That's for sure. But I should really emphasize that that's not the only kind of due diligence that I do. In the very same chapter where we meet Bix, he goes in disguise, as you said, to an academic discussion group so that he won't be recognized. I also gave the chapter to my friend who's a tenured art history professor, and she had important suggestions because the academic discourse wasn't quite right. So I think that, back to the general point, I haven't heard any creator make a serious argument in favor of policing the imagination. I'm not sure any of us wants to live in that world, including people who have made accusations of cultural appropriation. I think those accusations come from a feeling of pain, which is totally legitimate, exclusion, which is also totally legitimate, and frustration with sometimes feeling that the care that was necessary to do this job well didn't happen. So I just tried to do the best I could. That's kind of all I can say. And I do strongly feel that, no one wants an imagination police. That's the tool of autocrats. That's what Vladimir Putin does. That's when writers are thrown in jail for what they write. That's not the world any of us wants to live in. I think what is being demanded is greater care and consideration and not approaching things in a presumptuous way that says, because I'm white and privileged, I can do whatever the hell I want. That's not true. I don't think it, and I would never operate in that way.
Okay.
So I just tried to do my best.
Okay. Well, your best is amazing. And we only have like less than 3 minutes left. And I think somebody submitted an excellent question, which I think you've kind of answered. So I'm going to read her question to acknowledge it, but I think you've addressed it. Another Jennifer has said, do you think that the current environment of book banning and censorship will ultimately circumscribe authors' voices and mute them? In times of extreme censorship throughout history, authors turn to other means like the ballad or a children's fable. Is your sense that we are in a time when writers, and not just in repressed regimes, are more nervous about bringing out their voices and truths? Although we don't have time to, I think you've addressed part of that anyway. It's a wonderful question. There's so much to say there, but
I think that book banning is so far has done the opposite. The books that are banned sell better than they ever did. And I think it's such a loser approach. And I really hope that those who are instigating book bannings will think the better of it. As far as the censorship of the other kind that we were just talking about, through fear of being criticized for being presumptuous, I think that can have a chilling effect. But I hope that with time, as we creators all recognize that we have to have freedom of the imagination and want to be able to imagine beyond our own lives,
Okay.
we will all relax a little.
Okay, Jennifer, thank you so much. Thank you to the fest. I'm throwing it over to Sandra at the fest, who has a few words, but thank you for everybody for
Thank
coming.
you for your great
Okay.
questions.
This has been awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for attending the panel, and especially thank you to Jennifer Egan and Zsuzsi Gartner. If you, they started me without my video, there we go. If you're interested in purchasing the Candy House, please support festival sponsor and VFA bookseller Munro's Books. You can find the books featured during the festival in store and online at munrobooks.com. There are more festival events to come, so please visit our website, victoriafestivalofauthors.ca, to view the festival program and to find links to view most of this year's events online. On the website, you will also find interviews with all of this year's participating authors and a place for you to sign up for our newsletter. If you'd like to support the festival in another way, please give us a like and a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and encourage your friends to attend one of our upcoming events. You can also make a tax-deductible donation to the Victoria Festival of Authors through our website or on VFA's page at Canada Helps. Your donations do help keep us an engaging, accessible, and sustainable festival. I hope that we will see you at our next Zoom event, The Magical Writer, today at 3:30 Pacific. Curated and moderated by Danny Ramadan, The Magical Writer features authors Larissa Lai, Rasik Revolva, and Josh Whitehead. Thanks again. Have a wonderful afternoon.